The team dropped into the dense jungle under moonless skies, each man trained for silence and shadows. Their mission was simple: extract a rogue agent who had gone dark near the border, but by sunrise comms were dead, and movement crackled from every direction. They were not alone, and it wasn't wildlife tracking them. The forest greeted their boots with a soft chorus of leaking branches, crush and scraped undergrowth as if the ground itself resented their intrusion. The lead man slowed the formation, his instincts warning of unseen watchers in the gloom. He scanned the silhouettes of trees and vines that danced like specters in the night wind. Even when the wind held its breath, the leaves whispered anyway. As dawn approached, the canopy broke. Enough light to show more than shapes. The green mass pressed in tight. No sky to speak of, only holes where pale amber light dared to reach the ground. The team knew their insertion was compromised, and still they pressed deeper. The target had to be somewhere ahead, and the extraction point lay beyond a river crossing, whose map markings now seemed optimistic. The injured agent had intelligence worth millions. They reminded each other in low voice. The enemy couldn't allow him to talk. They would be hot on his trail, or his trail would be laid as bait. Already the men sensed something wrong. Their formation flickered as if reflexively someone slid off path to avoid detection. Not all moves here were theirs. At the ravine edge, the sergeant signaled halt. They crouched low on the moss-coated rock and peered down into the gully. The drop was steep water glinting black in the shadows, and across the chasm they saw footprints too fresh to be old. These prints were booted and led into the dense trees on the other side. Without speaking, they realized the agent had passed this way, or the enemy had followed them closer than thought. One of the younger operators reached for his radio and pressed the transmit button, but only static answered. The silence on the waves was heavier than the forest itself. The sergeant turned off the radio and shelved it. The jungle didn't allow chatter. It allowed survival. They moved again, slipping into the dark green tunnel of trees. The humidity clung to their gear, and boots offered no clean grip on the slick leaves. A distant rumble startled them. A branch snapped far ahead, and the echo carried strangely in the dense air. The men froze, their breathing shallow. Their hearts roared in their ears as they watched mist swirl where the sound had come. They advanced slowly, careful but eager. The mission demanded pace, though the jungle punished haste. Within the trees they discovered a clearing too perfect, a ruined watchtower half collapsed, vines strangling its wood, a sign of age or of deliberate trap. They circled around the perimeter, dust motes floating in the sunbeams that broke through overhead. The sergeant crouched near an overturned chair and scanned the scene. The chair bore. No occupant but one boot lay on the ground, laces undone, as if whoever wore it had fallen fast or cast it aside in flight. No sign of the agent yet. They pressed on past the tower into deeper undergrowth. The air smelled of decay and something else. A sharp metallic scent that made one man blink. The sergeant paused and frowned. The scent was blood or rust. He followed the smell to a battered helmet half submerged in mud, and his face went still. He signaled, "Stop." The men gathered around the helmet. Their flashlights swept the ground and found patches of dark staining the foliage, and small bits of torn fabric caught on thorns. The scene said enemy contact had already happened here. They had to assume the agent was ahead or behind, but in the net of this forest there was no way of knowing which direction meant safety. The sergeant raised his hand and motioned the team into a tighter V formation. They pressed onward slower now, more calculating. Every rustle turned into possibility. Every shadow became challenge. As the sun climbed higher, the canopy shifted light patterns across the dark floor, and the forest seemed to press further in. They came to a stream crossing, and the water ran cold and clear, but the banks showed signs of recent traffic footprints and broken branches. The young operator squatted and scooped water into his hand, his eyes never leaving the bank. They rose and regrouped. The agent or the enemy had been here quite recently. The sergeant glanced at his watch, but the numbers didn't matter here. Time stretched and folded ambiguous. The forest claimed hours and minutes as its own. They paused to check gear, recalibrate comms, though the radio still yielded only hiss. They deemed the network dead. Sergeant tapped his earpiece and whispered through the forest. "This isn't routine anymore," he said quietly. Their mission changed from extraction to survival. A distant cry like a scream echoed across the stream, and all 5 men froze. The sound reverberated off trees and water and died away as quickly as it arrived. The sergeant looked at each man. Their faces hardened. He mouthed, "We move." Now they advanced toward the direction of the cry, though every step felt heavier than the last. The forest's shadows seemed to recoil from their boots. They reached a place where trees were scarred and bark stripped, as if something large had passed recently. They found deep gouges in the wood and unfamiliar tracks too large for a man. The sergeant bent down and touched the track carefully. His eyes narrowed. The enemy here wasn't human, maybe it was, but the tools were bigger than boot prints, suggesting mechanized or something trained in these wilds. Hunger and exhaustion crept in, but protocol held them firm. They moved toward the coordinates dropped before insertion, though, in this forest, nothing worked as on the map. The ravine, the stream, the tower were all signs that the target had moved or the enemy anticipated every step. They realized the deeper problem wasn't just survival. It was being hunted. For the agent. For them. For something far darker. Dark gathered early under the canopy, and the sergeant called halt. They set up a small camp behind thick trees far from the open clearing. The men dug shallow trenches and set silent watches. 2 of them rotated. Rest 1 stayed at each flank. The quiet felt false. Too quiet. They heard breathing, but it wasn't theirs. It came from all around and from nowhere. At midnight, the sergeant awoke from his perch, hearing a click and then faint footfalls. The camp perimeter held, but the sound was close, and the crack of a twig sounded like a gunshot. He whispered, "Wake them!" The team stirred and weapons raised. They faced outward. The moonless sky gave no clue. The forest held its breath. Suddenly, a shadow detached from the trees, and a shot rang out. The world shivered. The bullet hit the ground near the sergeant, and dirt flew. His heart leapt. They traced the flash to a rifle muzzle glinting from above. They dived for cover. The men returned fire blindly, but nothing moved. The shooter had slipped away before they could aim. After the shot, the forest fell into a deeper silence. The only sound was their own heavy breathing. The sergeant counted their number. They were still 5, but one of them limped. Though the bullet had grazed a leg, the mission had just changed. Entirely. They were no longer just seeking the agent. They were also running from a sniper they could neither see nor track. The sergeant signaled movement. They packed up quietly under the canopy and followed a narrow deer trail that cut through the undergrowth. It twisted unexpectedly. They followed anyway because staying put meant waiting for the next shot. The stream ahead offered a crossing and perhaps a vantage for escape. They reached it by dawn, though the forest did not lighten it, only paled. They paused by the water. The wounded man drank slowly while the sergeant scanned opposite bank. The prints were gone. The trail had been wiped, clean as if the forest itself swallowed it. The sergeant frowned. This was no accident. He mouthed, "Stay alert." They set off again in single file. Step by step, they climbed a rocky incline. The canopy thinned slightly, and they glimpsed sky through braided branches. And then the forest cracked open into a small plateau with stones scattered, and an old stone wall half fallen. Its presence surprised them. This was not on their maps. The sergeant surveyed the scene. He motioned the team into cover behind large boulders. The wall looked like part of a fortification in some forgotten era. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the plateau looked more trap than refuge. He whispered, "We hold here until dark." The men nodded, knees shaking in silence. The wounded man leaned back against rock and closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. The sergeant stared at the horizon. No extraction bird, no friendly hum, only the wild breath of the jungle, and beyond it, the unknown enemy lurking unseen. The plateau wall had holes them like windows. Buildings once here had collapsed. He moved a flashlight across the stones and discovered a fresh boot heel imprint on the soft earth beside the wall. He knelt. He traced the print. He looked at the others. "This means we are expected," he said flatly, and then the wind whistled through the ruins and the shadows, shifted as if aware of their presence. Silence held them, and then from the trees came a low mechanical whir. Something flew overhead and vanished as suddenly as it arrived. They sprung up, their heads snapped toward sky, but nothing remained. The forest returned to quiet, but the message was clear. They were being watched by more than just men. They were under surveillance, and the rules changed. The wounded man opened his eyes. The sergeant saw his face pale. He spoke quietly. "It's not just him. It's them," they said, and his voice trailed off into the thick air. Night settled deep, and the stars hidden. The sergeant checked his watch again meaninglessly. Then he reached into his pack and eyed the faint outline of the agent's dossier still sealed. It contained the name of the man they were to rescue, but now it loomed like a curse. They shared a look. The forest held secrets not listed in the brief. They needed to decide whether to push forward, backtrack, or hold position. The agent's last known location seemed miles away, but so too did safety. The sergeant whispered, "We move at first light." The men nodded, tight fists raised in silent understanding, because in the jungle there was no turning back, only going on. And then the forest exhaled around them, and the shadows seemed to shift toward the little camp readying for dawn hours, turned into a full day, and the remaining SEALs were bleeding morale and supplies, pinned near a ravine with an injured teammate, and eyes behind every tree. The extraction zone was compromised. The enemy was herding them like prey one by one. They tried radioing backup, but only static answered them until a single shot rang out from the trees, dropping a hostile mid-step. No one saw the shooter, and the bullet came from nowhere, but it wasn't the last shot they would hear that night. The team froze the moment the first shot echoed through the jungle. It was clean, crisp, and final, and it came from a direction none of them could confirm. The fallen enemy collapsed without a sound, as if the bullet had known exactly where to land, as if the shooter had been waiting for hours, watching the entire standoff unfold. The SEALs stared at each other, unsure whether to run or return fire, but the jungle answered only with silence. No movement, no whisper, just the deep stillness that follows death. They repositioned fast, pulling the injured man into cover and circling their weapons out toward every gap in the trees, their eyes darting between shadows, shapes, and flashes that could be rifles or reflections, but nothing moved. They waited, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, then it came again, another shot this time farther away. Another body dropped this time, not enemy, but unknown. The figure wore mismatched gear and was armed with a rusted rifle, not part of any known unit. No insignia, no obvious allegiance. The sergeant whispered to hold fire. They were being helped. That much was clear, but the why behind it was what froze them. Something about the kill pattern was precise, almost intimate. These weren't suppressive shots. These were surgical single-round eliminations, and each time the shooter moved, they left no trace. No footprints, no scent, no sound. The sniper was either a ghost or someone who knew this terrain better than any of them. The night came fast under the thick canopy, and the forest swallowed the last of the light, leaving only the hum of insects and the growing paranoia that something was out there watching, waiting, deciding whether to help again or disappear forever. The SEALs took shifts, eyes wide, hearts pounding, weapons always at the ready, but nothing came. No second ambush, no patrols, no voices, just the occasional owl and the wind rustling the leaves above. At dawn, the sergeant scouted ahead and found 3 more bodies, all killed the same way. Single shot to the head or heart dropped mid-movement, their weapons still slung untouched on the ground. One of the bodies had a familiar tattoo, the kind issued in special operations units. Only this unit had been decommissioned years ago, and none of the men recognized the face that lay in the dirt. That meant someone was running black ops in territory they should not have been in, and it meant the SEALs were now caught in the middle of something far above their clearance. They moved quickly, knowing the pattern of death meant they were heading in the right direction or into a trap. Maybe both. The sniper had created a path of blood through the jungle, and they followed it with growing unease. Every 50 meters, another body, sometimes 2, sometimes more, each one cleanly executed without signs of struggle or panic. It was like they were being cleared a route by death itself, and every mile forward brought more questions than answers. By midday, they reached a burned-out vehicle flipped on its side, half buried in the mud and covered in vines. The insignia was blacked out, but the shape of it was unmistakable. It was a recon rover used by intelligence handlers, not field units, meaning the agent they were sent to extract might have made contact here, or might have been inside it when it went up. The explosion seemed recent, maybe 24 hours or less, and the smell of fuel still hung in the air. Inside the wreckage, they found a torn sat phone and half a torn map with 3 coordinates marked in black ink. One of them matched the extraction zone. The other 2 were deep in enemy-controlled territory, and the last one was right where they were standing, which meant someone had known they would pass through here days ago, long before they were ever deployed, and that someone was either setting them up or guiding them on purpose. Then the shot came again, echoing from the ridge above. This time, it wasn't a kill shot. It hit the ground near their feet, a warning or a signal or both. The men scattered, taking cover and aiming high, but nothing moved again. No flash, no sound, no visual confirmation, only the knowledge that they had just been marked and let go, not attacked, not targeted, just seen and acknowledged. The sergeant looked at his men and knew they were no longer operating under command protocol. This was something else. This was being watched by something or someone with a longer memory and deeper plans, and the sniper, wherever they were, was part of it. The injured teammate started mumbling about ghosts, and Shadows said he saw something moving between the trees that left no footprints, that breathed without lungs, and had eyes that shimmered like glass. But no one listened because they were all starting to believe him. As darkness fell again, the team set up camp near a cave mouth hidden behind a waterfall. The constant roar of the water gave them comfort and cover, and the cool stone provided a break from the stifling heat. The sniper did not shoot that night, and for the first time in 48 hours, the men began to doubt whether they were even the targets anymore. Maybe they were bait, maybe they were just moving pieces in a game they didn't understand. Just before dawn, a single bullet struck the rock above their heads and embedded itself in the cave wall. It had no note, no markings, no message, but it hit with such precision that it could only mean one thing. It was time to move again, because someone was still watching, and they had just made their next move. And from that point on, every step forward felt like walking into a plan. They did not make toward a meeting. They did not request with an ally. They did not understand, and behind them always was the sniper, silent, invisible, and one step ahead. The SEALs moved again, guided by the chaos and oddly timed gunfire that always seemed to clear a path for them. Whoever was out there knew their tactics. even anticipated their route. The shots were surgical, lethal, and eerily protective. When they reached a burned-out cabin to regroup, they found a spent casing on the windowsill, and carved into the wall were coordinates and a single name, one none of them expected to see again, a name erased from the team's roster years ago. The name scratched into the wood was jagged, rough, as if done with a blade, not a hand. The letters looked rushed but deliberate. The sergeant stared at them without blinking, as if the longer he looked, the less real they became. The others stood frozen in the half-collapsed doorway, their rifles aimed at the trees, but no one came. Nothing stirred, only the wind moving through the leaves like breath through teeth, and yet every one of them felt it. The change in the air, the sense of being watched not by the enemy, but by something more dangerous, more familiar. They swept the cabin quickly, moving like ghosts through dust and decay. The inside had been abandoned for years. But someone had returned recently. The footprints were fresh and wide-spaced, military boots, gear marks, drag lines. Someone had carried something or someone into the cabin and left nothing behind except that single casing and that cursed name, carved into splintered pine. The injured teammate leaned against the doorframe, his face pale as ash, his breathing shallow. The sniper, the one helping them, the one laying bodies like breadcrumbs across the jungle, was someone they knew or had known, someone long thought dead. The name carved into the wall was Graves, and that should have been impossible. Graves was KIA 6 years ago during an op gone wrong, behind enemy lines, left behind after an extraction went bad. The file was sealed, the comms had cut out, and his last words were screams and gunfire. But now his name stood carved in front of them, and someone had saved their lives with a shot that only Graves would have taken. It was the kind of shot he was known for. Impossible distance, deadly angle, no room for error. Only he could make it with calm precision and ice in his blood. The sergeant gave the order to move coordinates, led them northwest toward the edge of the jungle, near the old logging roads that had since been swallowed by vines and roots. They traveled in silence, minds reeling, hearts hammering, each step filled with dread. Because Graves had been more than a teammate. He had been the best of them, a shadow in human form, never missed, never cracked. And now he was back and killing people in their defense or killing everyone in his path. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge, and from its edge they could see the clearing marked in the coordinates. It was empty, but something about it felt wrong. Too quiet, too clean. The brush was flattened in a wide circle, and a few shell casings lay scattered, not fresh, but not old either. They were from a high-caliber long-range rifle, the kind Graves used back when he was theirs. The sergeant found a single photo nailed to a tree at the center of the clearing, faded by rain and sun, but still legible. It was a team photo. Their team before Graves disappeared. They were all there, smiling, tired, covered in dirt and blood and alive, and Graves stood in the middle, rifle on his shoulder, staring straight at the camera like he knew one day someone would come back and find it. The photo was marked with a red slash across the face of the lieutenant who had given the abort order on the mission that left Graves behind. That lieutenant had retired 2 years ago. He had died in a hunting accident last month or so, the report claimed now. The sergeant was no longer sure it had been an accident at all. Maybe Graves had already started a war of his own. Maybe he had come back with a list and a rifle and the skills to erase history, one name at a time. They moved through the clearing fast, following a trail of white cloth tied low to the trees, standard recon signal. Used by SEALs to mark a safe path, the knots were Graves style, tight, clean, tucked under the leaves, so only trained eyes would see them. It was like he was leading them somewhere, like he wanted them to find him or find something before someone else. Did the jungle changed as they moved thicker, darker, more oppressive, like it was resisting their presence. The air grew hot and heavy, sweat clung to skin, and every sound echoed as if bounced between invisible walls ahead. The ground rose into a bluff, and beyond it, they saw a figure crouched over a small device lens glinting in the light. But no one fired. They just stared, weapons ready. Nerves stretched thin because they knew if it was Graves and he wanted them dead, they would already be gone. The figure moved fast, vanishing behind the rocks before they could call out. The sergeant gave chase, the others followed, stumbling over roots and shale as they climbed the bluff at the top. They found a pack left open. Inside was surveillance gear maps. Photographs, all of them tagged with red dots and black lines tracing paths and patterns across the jungle. Some of the faces marked were familiar enemy commanders, smugglers, cartel leaders. Others were U.S. officers, intel agents, black site personnel. People who had once worked with or over Graves' one face was circled twice, and beneath it the words, "You left me." The sergeant felt something in his chest tighten. It wasn't guilt exactly, but something colder, sharper. The realization that Graves wasn't just alive, he was operating alone, calculating and lethal, and holding on to something darker than vengeance. He wasn't just targeting enemies, he was targeting everyone who had touched that mission that day, including them. Suddenly a shot rang out. From the trees behind them, not aimed at them, but past them, they turned to see a body fall just yards from their path. Someone had been following them, someone with a radio and silenced weapon. Not one of theirs, the sniper had struck again, saving them again before disappearing into the jungle without a sound. They ran now faster, heading toward the final mark on the map, a place circled 3 times in black ink. It was miles from any known route, buried in terrain. No drone could scan, and no satellite would watch. They reached it by dusk, a forgotten field station half buried in vines and dirt. The door hung open, and the lights inside flickered from a backup generator. They stepped in, rifles raised, and saw the figure sitting calmly in the far corner. He stood slowly, turned, and removed his hood. And it was him. It was Graves. But something was wrong. He was alive. Yes, but his eyes were hollow, and his first words were not a greeting. They were a question. "Why did you leave me?" And no one had an answer. Not yet. Pushing toward the coordinates, they found traps disabled before they reached them, and bodies already cold lying in their path. The sniper was hunting for them and hunting for someone else too when they reached the final ridge extraction. Birds already in sight. The sniper finally stepped from the trees, rifle still hot and face hidden, but the voice was familiar, broken, but strong. It was the man they left behind in a mission gone wrong, and he had one question before he let them leave. "Who gave the order to abandon me?" No one spoke at first, as if the air had turned to stone, as if words would shatter the moment and unleash something none of them could control. The man standing before them was a ghost, dressed in tattered gear and mud-streaked camouflage, his face half covered in beard and shadow and scars that had not been there 6 years ago, but his eyes were the same eyes that once scanned the battlefield for targets, eyes that had now become colder, sharper, deeper, filled with something more than pain and more than fury. The sergeant stepped forward, slowly lowering his rifle. Though his fingers ached to hold it tight, he tried to find words, but his throat was dry, his chest hollow because the man before him had been declared dead and buried, his photo placed on the wall of heroes, his name carved into stone. And now that name had come back to life with a sniper rifle and a question they all feared to answer. Graves stared at them without blinking, one hand on the rifle, one on the strap of the torn pack that held the photos. The names, the maps of every kill he had made since he crawled out of that jungle 6 years ago alone. Bleeding, hunted, and left for dead. They had thought he was gone. The mission had been a disaster, and the comms had failed. The team split under fire, and the call had come down from the bird to pull out or be lost. Themselves, no one had expected Graves to make it out alive, and maybe no one really wanted him to. He pointed at the sergeant, not with the barrel, but with his eyes, and said again, "Who gave the order?" The words echoed across the ridge, carried by wind and memory. The team shifted uneasily behind the sergeant, weapons lowered but not forgotten. The wounded man sat on a rock watching Graves, as if he were watching a man risen from the grave, and maybe he was. The sergeant spoke finally, his voice low. "It was command," he said. "We were ordered to pull out. You were cut off. We thought you were gone." He paused, then added, "We tried to go back, but the LZ was overrun. The bird couldn't wait, and we were told to move." Graves nodded slowly, his face unreadable. He looked down at the dirt beneath his boots, then reached into the pack and pulled out a second radio. Not military, issue not recent, and held it out for them to see. It was cracked, broken, covered in blood, but still holding a scrap of the last message he ever received. It was his voice screaming for help, and another voice cutting through, saying, "Abort, abort, leave. Him, we are done." That voice was not command. That voice was familiar. It was the voice of their own lieutenant, the one who had retired, the one who had died in a hunting accident. Now confirmed as a name crossed out on Graves, List Graves, looked back up, and said, "I was alive when you left me." And he said it not as accusation, but as fact, cold and final. Then he turned and walked to the edge of the ridge, looking down at the extraction site where the Black Hawk now hovered low rotor blades, slicing. The air he did not move, he did not fire. He simply watched, and the team did not follow. The sergeant stepped beside him and said, "We can take you back now. You don't have to stay out here anymore. You don't have to keep fighting alone." And Graves laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo through the forest and come back as wind. He said, "I'm not alone, not anymore. They're all here, every one of them, everyone they sent to die and forgot about." And then he gestured at the tree line where the shadows moved, like watchers in the dark where shapes stood just beyond view, weapons in hand, eyes reflecting light like glass. The team turned, rifles lifted, but Graves raised a hand and said, "They're not your enemy, not unless you make them. These are ghosts. Like me, they came back from places no one escapes from, and they follow me now, because no one else would and no one else ever will." The sergeant looked at them, those shadows, those men or things that were once men, and knew they were trained, they were disciplined, but they were changed. And what they served now was not a flag or a mission. It was Graves. It was loyalty to a man who had been betrayed by silence. Then Graves turned and said, "I could have killed you all a dozen times over. I could have left your bodies in the jungle like they left mine, but I didn't because one of you tried to come back and I never forgot." And he looked at the wounded man who now struggled to stand and meet his eyes. It was him, the youngest operator, the one who had screamed to hold the bird, the one who had fought to buy more time and nearly got himself killed in the process. Graves had heard his voice even through the static and chaos and remembered it like a thread, pulling him back through the dark graves. Walked to him and said, "You saw me when no one else did." And the wounded man nodded once, eyes wide and shaking, and Graves said, "For that you live, and they live." And then he turned and started walking back toward the jungle, toward the shadows that followed him through the leaves. The sergeant called after him, "Graves, what are you now?" And Graves paused just long enough to answer, "In what comes after the war." Then he vanished into the trees without a sound, and the forest swallowed him like a secret. Extraction bird dropped lower, and the team climbed aboard, weapons, still drawn eyes, still scanning, as if unsure whether they had just survived a mission or stepped out of a myth. The rotors lifted them from the ridge, and as they rose into the sky, the jungle shrank below them, green, endless, alive and watching. No one spoke for the first hour of flight. The medic patched the wounded. The comms finally buzzed with static. Turning to clean signal, HQ was already asking for status and updates and debriefs. But the sergeant only said, "Mission complete, agent confirmed, KIA," and that was the end of the report. No mention of Graves, no mention of ghosts, no mention of the man who came back to hunt the ones who had forgotten him. The file was sealed again, marked classified above top secret and buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, but the team knew they would never forget what they saw, what they heard, what they almost became.